Well, it would take a lot to push the first pardon by a president of the United States to that president's son out of the top news story slot in the American news media, but Donald Trump was able to do it. He did it with his history-making string of the most ridiculous presidential appointments in history this weekend, beginning with the first presidential nominee in history to have served time in federal prison, to later be pardoned by the president who is now nominating him, who, oh, by the way, is a family member. Donald Trump has chosen the convicted felon Charles Kushner to be his ambassador to France, an insult to France. It is a position for which convicted federal felon Charles Kushner is uniquely unqualified. Here's what the Republican U.S. attorney who prosecuted Charles Kushner in 2004 had to say about him.
It was so obvious he had to be prosecuted that, I mean, if a guy hires a prostitute to seduce his brother-in-law and videotapes it and then sends the videotape to his sister to attempt to intimidate her from testifying before a grand jury, do I really need any more justification than that? I mean, it's one of the most loathsome, disgusting crimes that I prosecuted when I was U.S. attorney.
Loathsome and disgusting, now the theme of the Trump confirmation process. That is not the only loathsome and disgusting behavior that has been documented among the Trump choices for his cabinet. On the same weekend that Donald Trump chose his daughter's father-in-law, a convicted felon, to serve as ambassador to France, after Donald Trump pardoned him, Joe Biden chose to pardon his son for crimes that surely would not have been prosecuted if Hunter Biden's father were not the president of the United States when Joe Biden was running for re-election, and assuming he would serve another 4 years in office, he said he would not pardon his son. But things have changed dramatically since he said that, with Donald Trump's election and Donald Trump's public promise to use the full force of federal prosecutorial power against his political enemies, which include anyone named Biden. To carry out that promise, Donald Trump nominated the absurdly unqualified Matt Gaetz for Attorney General. That nomination went down in flames of truth in a matter of days. And then this weekend, Donald Trump nominated an equally unqualified Trump acolyte for Director of the FBI, Kash Patel, who has promised to use federal investigative power to harm Trump enemies. Donald Trump and Kash Patel have both publicly promised unfair, illegitimate use of prosecutorial power against allies of Joe Biden, which obviously include Hunter Biden. And so, with that turn of events, that changed circumstances, Joe Biden obviously decided his son should not be subjected to a malicious Trump witch hunt, which Donald Trump promises will be malicious and unfair. The history of presidential pardons for family members is thin. It now includes only 3 presidents, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and Bill Clinton, who on his last day in office pardoned his brother Roger Clinton, who had pleaded guilty to trying to sell cocaine to an undercover police officer, a crime for which Roger Clinton served more than a year in prison. There is nothing in the personal history of any of the other presidents of the United States from George Washington forward to indicate that any one of them would not have done exactly what Joe Biden did in pardoning his son for nonviolent crimes committed under the influence of alcohol and heavily addictive drugs, including heroin. Donald Trump has nominated another former heroin addict to his cabinet, Robert Kennedy Jr. If you ask the friends and family members of the 2 wives of Robert Kennedy Jr. while he was a heroin addict, they might find what Robert Kennedy Jr. did while he was a heroin addict was much worse than anything Hunter Biden ever did. Robert Kennedy Jr.'s second wife was driven to suicide, in the view of many of the people closest to her in the final year of her life, by Robert Kennedy. But Donald Trump seems to think that everything Robert Kennedy Jr. did in his self-confessed heroin addiction is not just pardonable, but completely forgettable. The validity of the Biden pardon stands on its own merits as a legal matter. It has the classic components of a legitimate pardon: nonviolent crimes for which no one has ever been sentenced to prison time, both of those crimes committed literally on paper and under the influence of drugs. One of the crimes is an answer on paper on a gun permit application, and the other a matter of inadequate tax filings for which Hunter Biden has paid the taxes in full. That's it. Donald Trump's selection of a new FBI director in January will, of course, require the firing of the first FBI director Trump appointed, Christopher Wray. FBI directors now serve 10-year terms, and so Christopher Wray, appointed by Donald Trump, remained in office during the Biden administration. FBI directors can be fired for cause. Donald Trump's cause for firing Christopher Wray will be a lie. And on the basis of that lie, Donald Trump will send to the Senate Judiciary Committee for confirmation Kash Patel, the man who said he wants to destroy and eliminate the unit of the FBI that is tonight standing between us and the next 9/11 attack.
The FBI's footprint has gotten so freaking big. And the biggest problem the FBI has come out of its intel shelves. I'd break that component out of it. I'd shut down the FBI Hoover building on day one and reopening the next day as a museum of the deep state.
And the day after that, every terrorist in the world and in the United States now has an open invitation to try their next version of 9/11. And there won't be a single FBI agent on their trail, not one. He wants to demolish the intelligence unit. If Kash Patel somehow survives the confirmation process, it now seems that unlikely that Donald Trump's completely unqualified choice for Secretary of Defense will be able to survive one round of questioning in a Senate confirmation hearing of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Last week, we read to you the contents of the Monterey, California police report investigation of what a woman identified in the report only as John Doe described as a sexual assault and rape by Pete Hegseth in a California hotel room in 2017. The police report did not reach a conclusion about what happened in the hotel room after the police took statements from Jane Doe and Pete Hegseth. The police referred the matter to the district attorney's office, which chose not to try to prosecute the case, but also did not reach a finding about the case. With Jane Mayer's important breaking news reporting today, we now know much more about what the testimony will be in the Senate Armed Services Committee, where if Pete Hegseth loses even a single Republican vote in the committee, his nomination cannot get through that committee. That committee includes two Republican women, Deb Fischer of Nebraska and Joni Ernst of Iowa, who will be listening to testimony about Pete Hegseth's behavior while serving as the president of a very small organization called Concerned Veterans for America, funded by rich Republican billionaires. Jane Mayer reports that Pete Hegseth was forced to resign from that group after an internal investigation described him as, quote, being repeatedly intoxicated while acting in his official capacity to the point of needing to be carried out of the organization's events. The detailed 7-page report, which was compiled by multiple former Concerned Veterans of America employees and sent to the organization's senior management in February 2015, states that at one point, Hegseth had to be restrained while drunk from joining the dancers on the stage of a Louisiana strip club where he had brought his team. The report also says that Hegseth, who was married at the time, and other members of his management team sexually pursued the organization's female staffers, whom they divided into two groups, the party girls and the not party girls. In addition, the report asserts that under Hegseth's leadership, the organization became a hostile workplace that ignored serious accusations of impropriety, including an allegation made by a female employee that another employee on Hegseth's staff had attempted to sexually assault her at that Louisiana strip club. Jane Mayer's reporting also described Pete Hegseth as someone else and someone else drunk at a bar at a Sheraton hotel. Quote, the duo yelled, "Kill all Muslims," multiple times in what the staffer described as a drunk and violent manner. The staffer that described that behavior in an email obtained by the New Yorker concluded that email saying, "I sincerely care about the mission of CVA and the future of my kids and the country." Reached for comment. The author of the letter said, "If you print that, I will deny I wrote it." So much for him caring about the future of his kids and the country. The first time a president of the United States had a cabinet nominee defeated in the Senate confirmation process was when the seemingly easy to confirm Republican Senator John Tower was nominated by George H.W. Bush to the very same job that Pete Hegseth wants, Secretary of Defense. John Tower was eminently qualified, having served as the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, where his nomination was expected to sail through unanimously, as former Senate chairmen always do sail through confirmation hearings. But it was drunkenness and what they used to call in those days womanizing that brought him down.
My own review of the record, however, has led me to the firm conclusion that in 3 areas, the abuse of alcohol, the provision of consulting services to defense contractors on the probable outcomes of ongoing confidential arms control negotiations shortly after serving as an arms control negotiator, as well as instances of indiscreet behavior toward women, John Tower falls short of the standards, the high standards, which must be demanded of those who would bear the awesome responsibilities of Secretary of Defense.
So there's new reporting today from legendary reporter Jane Mayer in The New Yorker about the man who's been announced as the choice for defense secretary in the incoming administration. According to Jane Mayer's new reporting, before Pete Hegseth was hired to be a TV host at the Fox News Channel in 2017, he had been forced out of 2 small right-wing veterans advocacy organizations that he had been involved in. The first one was a group called Veterans for Freedom. They hired him on to lead that organization in 2007, according to Mayer's reporting. By 2008, the very next year, the group's finances had collapsed amid concerns about wild spending and, quote, sexually inappropriate behavior in the workplace. The group's donors soon folded the organization into a different veterans group, basically, according to Mayer's reporting, in order to get Hegseth's hands off the checkbook. So that was Veterans for Freedom. Then it was Concerned Veterans for America, where Hegseth was in charge from 2013 to 2016 before he was forced out of that organization, too. From Mayer's reporting, quote, a previously undisclosed whistleblower report on Hegseth's tenure as the president of Concerned Veterans for America describes him as being repeatedly intoxicated while acting in his official capacity, to the point of needing to be carried out of the organization's events. The detailed report, which was compiled by multiple former employees and sent to the organization's senior management, states that at one point, Hegseth had to be restrained while drunk from joining the dancers on the stage of a Louisiana strip club where he had brought his team from the organization. The report also says that Hegseth, who was married at the time, and other members of his management team sexually pursued the organization's female staffers, whom they divided into 2 groups, the, quote, party girls and the, quote, not party girls. In a separate letter of complaint, which was sent to the organization, a different former employee described Hegseth being at a bar in the early morning hours of May 29, 2015, while on an official tour through Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. He was drunkenly chanting at the bar, quote, kill all Muslims, kill all Muslims. Mayer says, quote, I spoke at length with 2 people who identified themselves as having contributed to the whistleblower report. One of them said of Hegseth, quote, I've seen him drunk so many times. I've seen him dragged away, not a few times, but multiple times. To have him at the Pentagon would be scary. Adding, quote, when those of us who worked at Concerned Veterans for America heard he was being considered for Secretary of Defense, it wasn't no, it was hell no. According to the complaint, at one such CVA event in Virginia Beach on Memorial Day weekend in 2014, Hegseth was, quote, totally sloshed and needed to be carried to his room because he was, quote, so intoxicated. The following month, during an event in Cleveland, Hegseth, who had gone with his team to a bar around the corner from their hotel, was described as, quote, completely drunk in a public place. According to the report, quote, several high-profile people who attended the organization's event were very disappointed to see this kind of public behavior, though the report does not identify them. Nevertheless, in October 2014, the group instituted a no-alcohol policy at its events. The following month, however, Hegseth and another manager lifted the no alcohol policy while overseeing a get out the vote field operation to boost Republican candidates in North Carolina. According to the report, on the evening before the election, Hegseth, who had been out with 3 young female staff members, was so inebriated by 1 a.m. that a staffer who'd driven him to his hotel in a van full of other drunken staffers asked for assistance to get Hegseth to his room. Quote, Pete was completely passed out in the middle seat, slumped over a young female staff member, the report says. It took 2 male staff members to get Hegseth into the hotel. After one young woman vomited in some bushes, another helped him to bed. In the morning, a team member had to wake Hegseth so he didn't miss his flight. According to the report, quote, all of this happened in public, while Concerned Veterans for America was, quote, embedded in the Republican Get Out the Vote effort. The following month, in December 2014, the group held an office Christmas party at the Grand Hyatt in Washington. Once again, according to the report, Hegseth was noticeably intoxicated and had to be carried up to his room. The report stated, quote, his behavior was embarrassing in front of the team, but not surprising. People have simply come to expect Pete to get drunk at social events. The 2015 federal tax filing by Concerned Veterans for America has an unusual note saying, quote, major problems developed in the last fiscal year were paused. The filing also describes Pete Hegseth as, quote, president outgoing. By the start of 2016, Hegseth was out of his job. I should tell you, NBC News has not independently confirmed the reporting in The New Yorker. Pete Hegseth would not comment for the piece, though someone described as an advisor to him told the magazine that the claims were, quote, outlandish. Joining us now is Jane Mayer, chief Washington correspondent at The New Yorker magazine. Ms. Mayer, it's really nice to see you. Thank you for making time to be here tonight.
So glad to be with you.
Did I get any of that the wrong way around, or is there anything else from your reporting that you want to highlight for our audience to understand in terms of what you learned about Mr. Hegseth?
Well, thanks so much. Thanks. You did a great summary. The one thing I would say that is also clear from this report is that we gave a spokesman, a lawyer for Pete Hegseth 2 days, basically, to respond, and they have not denied a single thing in this report. So they just said no comment after being given sort of very careful questions. The other thing I'd like to say is just that it's been almost a day since this story came out, and my phone has been ringing off the hook. I have been hearing from many more people who worked with Pete Hegseth who have come out of the sort of woodwork to say they too have stories along the same lines, stories of just drinking himself into sort of oblivion, all of which I think is, you know, I mean, I've got nothing against people having a good time in life, but it's when you combine it with running the Defense Department that it really does get to be an alarming picture.
I wanted to ask you about the first veterans group, chronologically the first veterans group that Hegseth was involved with, this group Veterans for Freedom. You say, under his leadership, Veterans for Freedom soon ran up enormous debt, and financial records indicate that by the end of 2008, the year after he became the leader of the group, it was unable to pay its creditors. The group's primary donors became concerned their money was being wasted on inappropriate expenses. There were rumors of parties that, quote, could politely be called trysts. A former associate of the group put it. One early Hegseth sympathizer said, I wasn't the first to hear there was money sloshing around and sexually inappropriate behavior in the workplace. I don't mean to be like dense here, but can you explain or just put in sort of different terms what exactly that allegation means about the the sort of combination of a fiscal problem at the organization, a financial problem at the organization under his leadership, but also something about what was going on in the workplace and with these parties.
Well, I mean, it's no secret to anyone who knows Pete Hegseth that he's had gone through at least 2 marriages, and there are many, many, many allegations of infidelity, which are the reason that his marriages ended, and that there's been a long pattern here that we've seen of sexually inappropriate behavior by him in the workplace, and overspending as well. And so that is what people saw even in the beginning, way back. That was back 2007. And as you say, by 2008, that organization was on the brink of bankruptcy. And it was, the thing is, if you think about it as a test of whether this person might be a manager of the largest federal department in America, it was an organization that had between 5 and 10 employees and a budget of between $5 and $10 million. I mean, it's minuscule, really. There's just no history that he has that shows that he's capable of managing a large organization.
Senator Richard Blumenthal told you, much as we might be sympathetic to people with continuing alcohol problems, they shouldn't be at the top of our national security structure. It's dangerous. The Secretary of Defense is involved in every issue of national security. He's involved in the use of nuclear weapons. Entrusting these kinds of issues to someone who might be incapacitated for any reason is a risk we cannot take. Jane, last question for you. As you were reporting this and trying to get comment from Hegseth, did you come across any indication that the Trump transition or that former President Trump himself was aware of these problems in Hegseth's past when he was announced, when Trump announced him to be the choice for defense secretary?
I mean, it's actually not clear. The lawyer for Pete Hegseth said that he was consulting with the transition team when we asked all these questions. But it's unclear whether Pete Hegseth came clean on this extraordinary back history in his professional life. And you know, I mean, he certainly did not disclose that there had been a rape allegation against him and that he had paid off a woman and signed a national, you know, an NDA, non-disclosure agreement with her in order to keep it secret. So, I mean, that was definitely not disclosed to the transition team. I mean, as you've been saying, I think if nothing else, this shows you what a tremendous mistake it is not to do background checks. I mean, the press, we're doing the best that we can, but, you know, we're not the FBI. And I was just, it was jaw-dropping what I learned about Pete Hegseth.
Yeah, and the fact that your phone, as you said, has been ringing off the hook all day today since this has been out there with more people calling to corroborate these kinds of allegations. We'll look forward to well, we won't look forward. We will expect your continued reporting on this, Jane. Thanks for helping us understand it. I appreciate it.
Okay. The chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee had what I think should be the most obvious stance on Trump's selection of Kash Patel to be the next FBI director. Senator Dick Durbin said, quote, Kash Patel is an unqualified loyalist and should be rejected by the Senate. He should be rejected. Dick Durbin doesn't need a confirmation hearing to know he's seen enough. That's because we're talking about a conspiracy theorist, a guy whose primary goal is to go after Donald Trump's perceived enemies. And a guy who was so troublesome, Bill Barr and Gina Haspel had enough sense not to want him near their agencies during the first Trump term. Not sure what there is left to get to the bottom of, but I'm all ears. Joining me now is Democratic Senator Alex Padilla of California. He's a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. It's great to see you, Senator.
Yes.
Lots of news this weekend and lots of important confirmation hearings your committee is going to be overseeing. So let me just ask you first about Kash Patel. I just read what Dick Durbin said. And you said yesterday that the nomination raises questions you'll raise during his confirmation hearing. So I guess my question is, what more do you need to know? And are you kind of reserving judgment on whether you're going to support Kash Patel or not?
Oh, no. Trust me. I mean, the fact that he's a conspiracy theorist is just the beginning of this process. You know, there's still time for Donald Trump or the team around him to come to true senses, just as they did with Matt Gaetz, right? This is an equally offensive nomination. But if they insist on going forward, then we're going to insist on the background checks. We're going to insist on a very thorough and firm confirmation hearing. I know how I'm going to vote for someone who believes in conspiracy theories, denies the results of the 2020 election, and then says I'm going to run the FBI by shutting down FBI headquarters. Are you kidding me? So that's just for starters. What should not be lost in this conversation, Jen, is the role and test for Senate Republicans. How are they going to choose to handle these extremist nominations? Are they going to be loyal to their oath of office, loyal to the Constitution of the United States, or loyal to Donald Trump? And every time he says kneel, they say how fast. That's the question.
Sounds like you're a no, a definitive no for Kash Patel. We can put you down for. Do you think, we were just talking about this, do you think there are Republicans on the committee who would join you and other Democrats in requiring FBI background checks in order to move forward with these nominations?
Look, I would like to think so. From our conversations, behind closed doors, those that want to respect the process. Some that I've seen a lot on national news of late, Senator Mike Rounds. All right, there's a lot that he and I may not agree on in terms of policy, but the way he's approached the process of all this, I think is a little bit encouraging. He's not on the committee, however. And so it'll be a test for the members of the Judiciary Committee, whether it's anybody appointed to the FBI, whether it's the Attorney General to oversee the Department of Justice, or any other of the positions within our jurisdiction. And I should point out, Jen, the fact that these stories are coming out after Donald Trump has announced nominees, right, for a transition team to refuse to allow for FBI background checks, as has been the norm. They're there for a reason. Tells you a lot about what kind of background they are doing or not doing. Whether it's Matt Gaetz and what we came to learn since, what we've learned from the Secretary of Defense nominee, Hegseth, what we're going to learn about Kash Patel or anybody else. That underscores the reason and the need for true professional FBI background checks to inform both Republicans and Democrats through this process.
There's a purpose for them, and why Democrats and Republicans have used them for decades. Pam Bondi, you said, I want to get this, you said you recently suggested that Matt Gaetz' pick was an attempt to make Pam Bondi look normal, which was a very funny way of phrasing it. You pointed to her refusal to accept the results of the 2020 election. This is another important nomination that's going through your committee. Have you made a decision about where you stand on the Bondi nomination?
Look, I maybe not a final, but I do begin skeptical because of what I pointed out when she was announced. For someone who denies the results of the 2020 election, someone who believed and touted that there was massive amounts of voter fraud throughout the country. You'll recall I was serving as California Secretary of State at the time and challenged, Team Trump to bring forward any evidence they had of that. Years and years later, not a single shred of evidence of massive voter fraud in America. And the fact that she served as one of Trump's personal attorneys, her role in the first impeachment trial, does beg the question, is she going in to try to do the job of Attorney General of the United States, independent of the political leanings of the White House, or is she going in to do Trump's bidding? The American people deserve to know.
Lots of questions I bet you will have during that hearing. I have to ask you about another. I started off the show talking about this, another big story today, and that's, of course, President Biden pardoning his son. And former Attorney General Eric Holder posted this on X. No U.S. attorney would have charged this case given the underlying facts. After a 5-year investigation, the facts it discovered only made that clear. Had his name been Joe Smith, the resolution would have been fundamentally and more fairly a declination. Pardon warranted. What do you think?
Yeah, look, I heard the announcement too. A little surprised, to be honest, because of President Biden telling us for months and months and months that he wouldn't pardon his son. Not sure I would have made the decision that he announced, but I do want to make sure that it's not taking our eyes off the ball. The reason we're talking about pardons here is because what we can expect in a second Trump administration. He's already signaled it.
January 6th, that was his response.
Right. The J6 prisoners in hit mind, the people who went through the judicial system and were found guilty of the many, many crimes committed at our nation's capital. Jen, talk about breaking away from norms. The peaceful transfer of power was interrupted for the first time in our nation's history. That's why he's breaking away from so many norms, whether it's FBI background checks for cabinet appointments, his consideration or flirtation with recess appointments. We have to restore norms that are put in place to protect the interest of our country, to protect our democracy.
Senator Padilla, thank you so much for walking over from the Senate tonight.
It's called that, but we made it.
You have such important nominations before your committee. I hope you'll come back and talk to us about them again.
Look forward to
really
it.
appreciate it. And coming up, some Republican senators are making it seem like Kash Patel is going to sail through his confirmation process. But I've worked in politics long enough to know what senators say publicly isn't always the full story. Lots of important conversations behind the scenes. Thankfully, I have two political insiders standing by, longtime advisor to Mitt Romney, Kevin Madden, and NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale. Join me next.
Christopher Catalogo is the California bureau chief at Politico. Cornell Belcher is a Democratic strategist and pollster and an MSNBC political analyst. Good to have both of you here. So Christopher, Politico reports that Governor Newsom, quote, rhetorical posture vis-a-vis Trump embodies a more chastened version of resistance. In Fresno last week, part of a tour to red-tinged California, he was combative and conciliatory, often in the same breath. Take a listen.
We know what happened the last time Donald Trump was president. He vandalized our progress. He vandalized our programs. He broke the law. We reacted to the assault. It wasn't a proactive litigation strategy. It was a reactive strategy. I hope there's not one lawsuit with Trump administration. As I said, open hand, not a closed fist.
So he says he hopes there's no lawsuit, right? But let's not kid ourselves. Last time when Trump was president, there was something like 120 lawsuits filed by California against the federal government. So give us a sense from the ground in California of the line Newsom is walking for someone widely considered to be a 2028 contender.
Yeah, I think you've set it up really well there when it comes to how Newsom is planning to approach Trump. And I think one thing we need to say is a lot of this is not theoretical. There were 120 lawsuits, 122 to be exact last time. And Newsom dealt very personally with Trump on the phone throughout the couple years where they overlapped. A lot of that had to do with disaster relief. And I've spoken with Newsom extensively about what that was like, and Trump trying to withhold some money to negotiate for some things he wanted, for California to back off on some of its climate policies. And so, again, this is not something where he's coming in fresh and has not had these dealings with Trump. You also look at how Trump has dealt with Newsom. I mean, Newscum, the nickname that Trump used for Newsom, that was sort of almost a throwaway line in almost all of his rallies down the stretch. So he's very familiar with Newsom. Newsom, I think, is trying to be proactive this time. The purpose of the special session is to put away $25 million in an account. Last time, I think they spent at least $42 million in California on these lawsuits. And the argument that Newsom and the state are making is that so much money is on the line here for the state, and that this is basically an investment. You spend 25 on lawsuits, you then free up or basically make available to the state a bunch of money from the federal government, whether it's on climate issues, whether it's on health care, whether it's on disaster relief, even on issues of grants for local law enforcement who don't want to participate with the federal government in deportation raids. And that money could be taken away by the Trump administration. So there's a ton of money at stake here. I know that 2028 looms, and certainly Newsom is walking that fine line now. But we'll see. Once Trump takes office, once Trump is there taking these actions, there may be, this is, the most anti-Trump state in the union. There is certainly going to be pressure on Newsom to fight Trump on these things. And right now we're not seeing that because Trump is not yet in office. And so you got to factor that in too. Right now we're in kind of the post-election, post-mortem phase where people are looking at Trump supporters and looking at what Democrats might be able to do. Some of that might go out the window once Trump is in office and once Trump is taking actions that are deeply unpopular with Democrats.
So, Cornell, it's obviously not just Newsom. There are quite a few blue state governors. They have a group that they've put together who are doing a similar balancing act, let's call it that. They vow to fight the Trump administration when needed. And I should say attorneys general have gotten together, Democratic attorneys general as well. But if you really are serious about thinking about running for president in 2028, do you essentially have to start figuring this out now?
Yeah, well, Chris, it's crazy that we're talking about 2028 right now, but that's how.
But
American
you know, they're
politics is.
thinking about it.
No, you're absolutely right. It never stops, and people are starting to position themselves now to do it. Look, I think a lot of before 2028, I think there's going to be a midterm. I think there's going to be a midterm that's going to be really important for Democrats. Look, I've seen this cycle back and forth. Like, you know, he won in 2016, and then Democrats had an overwhelming victorious midterm election. And look, I think you'll see some state races coming up as well as midterm races that are coming up, and you'll see some positioning. But yeah, I'm not surprised at all that Democratic governors and AGs are putting together policies and plans to sort of fight for their values. And what the opposition party has to do, and look, Democrats are the opposition party now, is, you know, lay out what our values are and then go out there and fight for our values. So I don't begrudge any of the governors or the AGs for doing that, because that they're doing, Chris, what the opposition party should be doing, is taking a stand and fighting for their values.
So, Cornell, I wonder how deep you think the problem is. There's an interesting article in the Associated Press that was one of many saying that Democrats can't even agree on if there is a problem. Look, I mean, there is no leader in place, right? I mean, Kamala Harris lost. Joe Biden is on his way out. Now he's in the middle of a pardon controversy. But is there any consensus that you hear among folks that there is a serious problem? Are they looking to a new DNC chair to start paving the way? What's the path? What's the path toward a successful midterm?
Well, there's no silver bullet, right? And I think people who are looking for silver bullet, and a lot of the sort of hot takes and that you see out there, analysis that it's one thing, right? If Democrats had did this one thing, we would have won. Or if, you know, we just had this messaging tweak, we would have won somehow. After every look, I've been doing this a while. My hair is gray, Chris. I've been doing this a while. You know, after every bad election, Democrat. After every bad election, you know, it's, if we just had a better economics message, we would have won, right? I've been hearing that for a couple of decades. Look, I work for a guy by the name of Howard Dean, who in 2004, you know, Karl Rove Republicans were talking about a permanent Republican majority. And Howard Dean came in, and we had some crazy idea about a 50-state strategy where maybe we should actually engage voters on the ground and fund grassroots programs and not all be centralized out of Washington. And you know what happened after the 50-state strategy, Chris? We had a really successful midterm election where we took back the House, and then we followed that up with Barack Obama, an historic victory, right? There's no permanent anything in American politics. It's all a hurricane, and it's all being eroded and falling apart as we try to put it back together, and there's no silver bullet.
Joining us now, NBC News Washington managing editor Carol Lee, who was part of the team to first report on this pardon. Also with us, Matt Visor, Washington Post White House reporter, Chuck Rosenberg, former U.S. attorney and senior FBI official, and Ankush Khardori, former federal prosecutor. So, Carol, you were part of the team that broke this news last night. How did the president go from never pardoning to blanket pardoning?
Well, according to our reporting, Jose, the president actually never really took this idea of pardoning his son off the table, despite publicly saying that he would not do so. What we were told is that in June, after Hunter Biden was convicted on gun charges, there were discussions about this, and the decision was made to publicly message that the president would not pardon his son, even though it hadn't been fully ruled out, and the idea was still very much an active possibility. Now, what happened in the last few weeks is obviously former President Trump, now President-elect Trump, got elected. That that raised concerns that potentially Hunter Biden could be targeted, and to use the president's words, in a new Trump administration. And so that it largely became inevitable that this is something that the president would do. And now we heard from the president in that statement where he talked about this and said that he believes that politics played a significant role in what his son was facing. He said that it had infected the process and led to a miscarriage of justice. And he said to the American people that I hope Americans will understand why a father and a president would come to this decision. So far, Jose, we've seen mixed reactions, criticism, obviously, from Republicans, but also some Democrats. And yet the president this was something that he and the family discussed. He made the final decision over the weekend. And now Hunter Biden has a pretty broad pardon.
Yeah, I mean, Carol, what was the calculation inside the White House about the sweeping nature of this pardon? Something we haven't seen since, well, decades.
Well, it's a great question, and I think the question is whether that piece of this has to do with the fact that we have a President-elect Trump and those concerns that once there was a new Trump administration, could that administration launch new investigations into Hunter Biden? And so this decision to cover this nearly a decade-long period where Hunter Biden cannot be investigated or charged with anything that he may or may not have done during that time frame, that really takes care of that in that sense. And look, the fact that, Jose, this has happened before Hunter Biden's sentencing, which was scheduled to happen in just days from now, in his gun charges trial, and then the plea on tax evasion charges. That means that Hunter Biden also, what the president did here, he doesn't have to go through those proceedings. So there's still a lot of questions here. I'm sure a lot of people will be asking them, but this is something that is very, very broad.
Carol Lee, thank you so very much. Really appreciate it. So, Matt, this decision by the president comes right after a report was released on Saturday by Hunter Biden's legal team criticizing the foundation of the investigation and warning of a harsh sentence. Here's part of what that report said. Quote, "There is no disputing that Trump has said his enemies list includes Hunter. The prospect that Trump will turn his vengeance on the special counsel of prosecutors if they fail to take a harder line against Hunter, no doubt exerts considerable pressure on them not to let up on Hunter." Clearly, the president was concerned his son could do serious prison time here.
That's right. And that is, I think, underlying a lot of why President Biden is doing this and doing this right now is the fear really of what Trump and a Trump Justice Department may do to Hunter Biden. As Carol had alluded to, this pardon is quite broad, covering a time period of more than a decade, really covering all possible aspects of the controversial business dealings that Hunter Biden had been engaged with and could be pursued by a Trump Justice Department. And so that really is the aspect of this timing here. There's certainly a personal element to this in the president choosing to pardon his son. And there's a political element to it. And it really has pitted the president's loyalty to his family against his pledge to stand up for institutions and the rule of law. And so the politics of it are quite tricky, even though there's a personal element of him trying to protect his son.
Yeah, I mean, Chuck, the broad nature of his pardon, which really wipes the slate clean, as Matt was just saying, for Hunter Biden from 2014 to yesterday. This covers everything Hunter Biden has ever been found guilty of, but also anything else that may have happened from 2014 on. How unusual is this?
Well, it is broad and sweeping. Pardon powers are plenary, as you know, Jose. And unusual, sure, in the sense that it's the president's son, and the president used his power as a father and he said as a president to clear him, to grant him clemency. I do want to point out one thing, one caveat. I was a federal prosecutor for a long time, and indeed including as a criminal tax prosecutor for a period. And often when you have a federal tax crime, you often have a state tax crime, because in so many states, your federal income tax and your federal tax forms are made part of the state return. Presidents can only clear somebody for federal offenses. And so it's possible, Jose, at least theoretically, that Hunter Biden still faces state criminal tax liability. We'll see if states come after him. But as far as the federal cases are concerned, they're done.
And Ankush, you wrote just recently for Politico, quote, particularly in the wake of Trump's victory, Biden is on strong ground at a minimum to commute any sentence of imprisonment for his son Hunter before he leaves office. Not a pardon, exactly, you wrote, but an important show of mercy. This, Ankush, is not only a show of mercy, because this is not a commutation or a pardon of just the specific things that Hunter Biden has been accused of and found guilty of, but this is anything and everything that could have been undue since 2014.
Yeah, it is quite broad, and I think everyone is pointing out correctly that a motivation here is almost certainly the appointments that Donald Trump has been announcing and what they indicate about the willingness of people like in senior positions in the incoming administration to try to target Hunter Biden. That clearly is motivating the sweep of the pardon, the assumption that maybe they would come after him again. The one thing I would say about this, though, as people are debating this and have been debating this, is that, you know, it is highly unusual, as you've noted, that there would be a pardon going back 10 years. 10 years is basically the longest that most long-term criminal statutes have to apply, like bank fraud has a 10-year statute of limitations. But federal prosecutors have been investigating Hunter Biden for quite some time. Last summer, they also implied that they might be able to bring a criminal case against him for under FARA, and that was advanced as one of the reasons why the plea deal fell apart. We're now a year and a half after that. There's been no criminal FARA case. They've had years going back to the first Trump administration to go through Hunter Biden's financial and personal dealings and bring any criminal cases that were appropriate. I would be extremely surprised if there's any credible criminal case left on the table for this period. I understand that the pardon is sweeping and unusual, but I think it's important to put that context here.
And Matt, meanwhile, what do you think Trump's choice of Kash Patel to lead the FBI likely had any impact on Biden's decision to issue this pardon?
Well, I think that was a big motivation. I mean, I think that the president has been watching as President-elect Trump has made his appointments. They were struck initially by the Matt Gaetz appointment, which of course fell apart. But, you know, Trump is appointing people, the very people who would go after Hunter Biden. And so I think that is one of the main motivations behind the sweeping pardon that the president issued to his son. And that was along with the report that Hunter Biden's legal team had focused on over the weekend, was to point out the threats that Hunter Biden would face going forward. But he also faced, you know, sentencing, the threat of prison time. And I think that was a big factor here as well. Over the next 2 weeks, he was scheduled to be sentenced in both California and Delaware. And there was the very real possibility that he would have faced jail time in that. And so, you know, the president, you know, part of the psychology of him and looking at his son, who did deal with a drug abuse issue where the president, you know, was helpless almost in trying to help his son. And in this instance, he felt like he could do something to help him, and he did. But there's a lot of political implications to that decision.
Yeah, I mean, Chuck, and you were just saying that presidential pardons for family members aren't necessarily new. I mean, Clinton pardoned his brother, Trump pardoned Jared Kushner's father, Charles Kushner, who he just picked to be U.S. ambassador to France. What do you make of the timing, however, of this one?
Well, it makes sense to Matt's point. The sentencing proceedings in both Delaware and California were pending. They were imminent. And so rather than have the court go through that process, rather than have his son go through that process, the timing makes sense to me. The pardon doesn't make sense to me, but the timing of the pardon makes sense to me. By the way, if you look carefully at what Mr. Biden said, you know, he said he was acting as a father and as a president. And as a father, I get it, right? He's taking care of his son. He loves his son. He doesn't want his son to go through any more heartache or face the possibility of prison. As a father, makes perfect sense. As a president, I think it was a mistake, Jose. I think it was a mistake to characterize the proceedings as tainted and political. I think it was a mistake to suggest that the prosecution was selective. That has a real meaning in our prosecutorial world. It was a mistake to suggest that there weren't valid charges. Remember that Hunter Biden was convicted by a jury in Delaware by proof beyond a reasonable doubt and unanimously, and that he admitted under oath in a California federal court that he had committed tax crimes. And so the notion that he hadn't committed crimes or that the process was tainted and political, I think it's deeply unfortunate for a president of the United States to say that. Mr. Biden, at least in this instance, sounds a good bit like Mr. Trump, in my view.
It's my favorite part of the show, money, power, politics. Tonight, Donald Trump's dollar diplomacy. Want to know what that means? Well, the president-elect has threatened the BRIC countries with 100% tariff if they stop using the dollar as their main currency for trade. BRICS, of course, stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and it now includes several other developing nations. Donald Trump's warning is just the latest proposal that has investors betting his economic agenda will likely disrupt global trade and accelerate inflation. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden's economy, well, it broke records this holiday weekend. The cost of Thanksgiving dinner was the lowest it has been in 5 years. Highways and airports were packed this weekend, and Black Friday sales almost hit $11 billion, and that is before we even got to Cyber Monday, which I can say I have fully been scammed by Cyber Monday. I woke up this morning, I bought a ton of stuff on sale that I wasn't even looking to purchase. So way to go, big box stores. You got me. Let's bring in Peter Spiegel, U.S. managing editor for the Financial Times, and Peter Goodman, global economics correspondent for the New York Times and author of How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. Mr. Spiegel, if people were saying that they were unhappy with Joe Biden's economy, how do you think they are going to feel if Donald Trump follows through with his economic agenda?
Yeah, well, look, we've talked about this before. You know, if inflation was the thing that brought down Kamala Harris brought down the Biden regime because of the people were so grumpy about it, these tariffs will be even more inflationary. And I know global trade is not something that is seen as sexy, and Peter and I were just lamenting this before.
It's sexy to you guys.
It's sexy to us.
It's back. Yeah.
But it's bad for growth, right? If the global economy, through tariffs, begins to slow down, that means growth in the U.S. slows down, which means jobs slow down. People start getting laid off. Their wages come down. It's going to have knock-on effects. And, you know, Harris tried to explain this during the campaign rather ineffectually, I would argue. And we're in for, and you've started to see this now in the financial markets, right? Particularly, we talked before in the bond market. U.S. Treasuries, which is basically investors believing whether the U.S. government can pay its debt or not. You've seen, well, prices go down, yields go up, right? They are losing confidence.
Big investors saying we are worried about what's going to happen here.
It's already happening. Just through the rhetoric, through the tweets, through everything like that, you've seen the market react. Wait till these actually become policies.
Okay, but there are folks out there, especially in Trump's camp, who say this tariff talk, this is just negotiating tactics. He's not really going to go through with it. He's going to scare people and they will come to the table. You've pointed out that people said the same thing about Brexit.
Right. That's right. I mean, I lived through Brexit. Actually, we both lived through Brexit, and that was a classic example.
Just so you know.
We were in London.
Okay.
Yeah, both of us were in London.
Everyone here and alive.
You know, that was a moment where people said, no, this can't happen. I mean, at the end of the day, no sovereign state is going to sever itself economically from its largest trading partner. And of course, that is what happened, because once politics get tribal and people are thinking about taking back control or policing the border or whatever, a lot of terrible economic ideas get actually brought to creation. And it is reminiscent of that to be having this conversation. And we don't know if it's a negotiating position. We don't know if it'll really happen, though. You know, it's pretty hard to dismiss anything that Trump says. I mean, he did a lot of stuff he said he was going to do in the first administration. And the idea that we're going to have serious tariffs against the three largest trading partners simultaneously, that is very disturbing, because it's not just the finished goods. There are factories in the United States that all this policy is supposedly about, you know, helping realize a revival, right? We're supposed to be bringing jobs back to the United States. A lot of people work at factories in the United States that depend upon imported components from
okay,
Canada,
but
Mexico.
on the other hand, Donald Trump threatened to slap a 25% tariff on all goods from Mexico and Canada. And what happens? Justin Trudeau takes the next plane to Canada. He's having the surf and turf at Mar-a-Lago. It could be that I was in Canada over the weekend and he just wanted to get out of the country. But what do you make of that meeting?
I mean, look, it is, I mean, it's the last time around, right? It is U.S. policy by tweet, although it's on a different platform now.
Same.
It's the same thing. But, you know, the fact of the matter is, okay, maybe it works, but that's not normally how U.S. economic policy is done. We have, as the largest economy in the world, the most powerful military in the world, we have something that is called the public good. There is a general role the U.S. has played since the post-war era of establishing free trade, you know, safe seas. Then it's the role the Americans have played in it. We have not been the bully. And you get back to this point where you make about the BRICS, this bullying of the BRICS on the dollar. In general,
yeah, but Trump's
people use
not
the
keeping
dollar.
that a secret. He's saying the status quo doesn't work. I'm here to bully. I'm here to change the game. And his supporters are saying we're here for it.
Yeah, okay, they are. But my point would be is if you start, you know, threatening people with pulling the dollar and you know, what's going to happen? They will go to the Chinese and say, you know what, we don't use the dollar anymore. Look what the Saudis have done with the Chinese on their oil. They said, you know what, let's price it in renminbi, right? If you start bullying people, what they'll say is, you know what, the reason we invest in dollars is because the Americans have the world's interest. It's a safe haven. They have the world's interest. They play by the rules. They have courts. If they start bullying me, why am I playing with the Americans anymore? I'll go with someone else. I'll go with the euro. I'll go with the renminbi.
China has already, you're the supply chain expert.
Yeah.
China has said, we're going to fight your tariffs with supply chain warfare. Explain this.
China is in a position where they're in control of things like rare earths, lithium, electronic components that actually end up in the semiconductor supply chain. And if they want to withhold those things, if they want to weaponize their control of key ingredients, that is a new level of trade war. It's not just about, okay, you know, you're going to hit us with tariffs on apparel we're sending to the United States. Well, we're going to slap tariffs on incoming soybeans and we're going to hit ag states. No, this is next level. This is, we're actually going to cripple your capacity to make advanced products that we really need. And China is in a weird position on this next phase of the trade war, because on the one hand, they're much more susceptible to a slowdown in exports. And so that argues that the U.S. has greater leverage. On the other hand, they're dominant in emerging technologies like electric vehicles.
Hold on. I got a new topic for you that we have to hit.
Wow.
Because this is a story that people may have missed, but it's important. Because over the last couple of days, we saw the CEO of chipmaker Intel get forced out. If you are not in the business world, you're not focused on this, but I want you to explain to us why this is so important and what it has to do with the CHIPS Act, because Intel was given an enormous amount of money as part of the CHIPS Act, and one would think that their CEO would be riding high, and instead, he's riding the bus
So
home.
this falls on exactly what Peter was talking about. So there was a decision made that for the reasons Peter talked about supply chains, we cannot rely on East Asia in particular, Taiwanese semiconductor providers.
We realized this during COVID.
We did this during COVID. So let's give incentives to American companies to build in the U.S. The criticism of these kinds of industrial policies has long been the federal government should not be in the business of picking winners. Right? That's always been the criticism. You know, we criticize
Let the markets
French.
do it.
Let the markets do it. We criticize the French for their strategic yogurt, you know, industry. And what has happened is the U.S. government has backed a loser. Intel has had problems for years now. NVIDIA has beaten them on the design of the chips. Taiwan Semiconductor has beat them on the making of the fabricating of the chips. They were the biggest lobbyists for this CHIPS Act, and you know, it's a bipartisan.
Okay, so they were really good at lobbying and they were really bad at chip making?
Well, they're good at finance. I mean, here's the part of the story that never gets told. So, yes, they blew it. They didn't buy NVIDIA. They could have. They could have jumped into AI. They blew it in not getting a deal to supply iPhones with their chips.
Yes.
Where they really blew it is between 2005 and 2020, they funneled $108 billion into buying back their own shares. No, investors loved it.
Okay, but that's what Intel did. Now the government has pumped all this money into this company, our taxpayer dollars.
Right.
Where's that money and what's to come of this chip
So they're still building the plants outside Phoenix, Arizona, in Ohio and whatnot. The problem is there's no customers for these anymore. Why would you make your chips at Intel fabrication plants when you could do it at Taiwan Semiconductor and they're better at it? So now Intel has a new strategy. Should they sell that off? You know, what Intel's mistake was is they were trying to compete with NVIDIA in design and compete with Taiwan Semiconductor on fabrication, and they were bad at both of them. And this is the problem. Again, I hate to sound like the Financial Times guy when it comes to government picking the winners, when the government decides how to organize an economy. If the markets do it, you get winners like NVIDIA, which is good old American company. So it's not like we're relying on foreigners for chip design. An American company did bold things and was successful. That's the way the market's supposed to work. We shouldn't have the federal government picking winners and forcing them to build plants at the taxpayer expense.
If Frank Rule were here, he would say, sounds like they needed a little better intel.